Hey there guys, welcome back to the channel. So today's video is all about the UCAT abstract reasoning section, and I'll be explaining various tips and tricks which you guys can implement when revising for this section and also give you examples to show you how it's done. This is a similar structure to my previous UCAT videos such as UCAT quantitative reasoning and UCAT verbal reasoning, which you can find in the description below. So anyways, let's get on with the video. So firstly, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Shivank and I'm currently a year 13 student during my summer holidays. And I decided what better way to spend my time than to start a YouTube channel. I'm also now going to be an Imperial Medical student starting in October, having achieved 3 stars on results day. And I'm quite happy about it, and more videos will be upcoming about that. But for now, let's focus back on the UCAT abstract reasoning section. So as I mentioned, I'll start off with the various tips and tricks that you guys can do before then moving on to the examples. Or I'll explain examples as well here and there. So first tip, which I think is the most common tip, is look at the simplest box. So what I mean by the simplest box, this is the box which has the least number of distractors. And our distractors are things which are simply there to distract you, as stated by the name. So an example of this is, let's say there's two boxes. One box has one circle and the second box also has one circle but has four squares around it. And we have to identify the pattern between both of them. So now it's quite obvious if we look at the simplest box that it has a circle. And so in our mind we either presume two things. One, each box must have a circle in it, or for example each box must just have one side, or like around one side. And so if you look at the next box, we can then use this and identify, okay, every box must have a circle. It's quite obvious knowing these two, and now we can look at the answer options and just go on with it. And so looking at the simplest box is really useful because it really saves time. So we're not spending time looking at the distractors, i.e. in this case it would be the four squares, and so we save time and can move on to the answer options. So if some of you have worked it out, there's usually a minute per set, and this leads on to my second tip. And this is where you have around 1 minute to try and find all the patterns possible for that set. So for example, if we go back to the example where one box has a circle and another box has a circle and four squares. And if you notice, the first box has only one shape, whereas the second box has five. So they're both odd numbers. And if we look at table B, one box has two shapes, and for example, another box has four shapes. So that's the second pattern we found out. The idea that in table A, you must have a circle in each box, and also the idea that it must be an odd number of shapes in each box. And so we found two patterns quickly, and then we can look at the answer options and just find ones which work with them and then move on. Now, often what we do is because we get too caught up in trying to find patterns, and so we spend way too much time finding really complicated patterns that do work and they probably are correct, but we can better use this time trying to do other questions. For example, let's say there's two sections. We get 5 out of 5 in the first one, but because we spend so much time in the first section, we only get 1 out of 5, if most 2 out of 5. Whereas if we spent less time and got 4 out of 5 in the first section because one of the sections follows a complicated pattern, and then the second section we got 4 out of 5 again, that's clearly better, and we probably saved a lot of time because we had time to spend on both sections, and so we're less stressed out overall. And so I really recommend the idea that you have just restrict yourself to 1 minute. You can see the time on the top right. So just restrict yourself to 1 minute and try and find as many patterns as you can, and then try and solve the questions. Unfortunately, though, sometimes we do spend more than 1 minute, so sometimes we spend 1.5 minutes. And as soon as you realize that you spend too much, just flag the question instantly, guess, and then move on. Make sure you always guess. You don't want to be that one person who could have got really high, but because you left every question blank, you lose a lot of marks. So just make sure you just flag the question, guess, and then move on instantly. So now moving on to tip number 3. Look for the simple patterns. Don't overcomplicate things. There's no point. You're going to waste a lot of time thinking about, oh, the square is positioned in the top left here, and the square is positioned in the top right. Therefore, it must be positioned in either the top corners all the time. No, not necessarily. Each box has a square. Simple. Just move on and be very quick about this. This is because often in the they understand it's really time pressure. I think personally for me, this I felt was the most time pressured, but with more practice, it became much easier. And so they don't want to be really harsh on you. They really want to be able to identify the patterns as quick as possible, and so they're usually quite obvious. If you do again find a really difficult pattern, and this can happen once in a while, just flag and move on, and just guess the questions, because honestly, that really helped in my UCAT, and I think that's why I was able to score quite high, to be honest, with 870. And so just make sure you're able to flag and really move on in the abstract reasoning. I think that's a really key tactic here, and it really applies for this section because, for example, in verbal reasoning we have more time, we can read the passage or skim read the passage, whereas in abstract we have to be really quick. So now moving on to tip number 4, which is perhaps, I believe, the most important tip and the most unorthodox tip. This is where we don't look at the test shape. So let's say there's table A and there's table B. So table A is all about, for example, squares, and table B is all about circles. And the test shape is, for example, square and circle. So it's quite obvious here if we look at the test shape that if it's in either, and we can move on. But what we often do is we look at the test shape, for example, it has a square and a circle, and let's say we look at then we look at table A. We see it as a square, so we're like, okay, if it's in table A, we take it and then move on. This is wrong. This is why whenever you do this type of questions, you first look at the two tables, so table A and table B, and then look at the test shape. This is because when we look at the test shape, we automatically in our mind create some rules for it that only work for the test shape, and then try and force ourselves to find those same rules in table A and table B. And if we do not find those specific rules in table A or table B, we immediately mark it as wrong and then move on. Whereas in reality, there was often a much simpler rule or a different rule to the one you had found, and that would have worked perfectly with one of a table A or table B. So always make sure you look at the tables first before looking at the test shape. Obviously look at the test shape, don't just ignore it, but just be really methodical about it. I think that's really key. So tip number 5 is have a structured way to approach the UCAT abstract reasoning section. This is because there's usually a lot of patterns that you have to identify within the UCAT, and so just be really methodical about how you go on without this. You can use various acronyms that I mentioned, for example, as I mentioned, LISA, so lines, interactions, sloping, and angles. These are the 3 things you want to associate with lines. There's also SSSPN, as I mentioned, and these are very useful in being able to identify key patterns within the abstract reasoning section. Another few tips which I also did is I usually always wrote down any weaknesses that I had. So any weaknesses that I noted in my abstract reasoning section, I wrote it down and made sure on the day I just had a look and made sure I didn't do the same mistakes again. So for example, clocks. So clocks I found really, really difficult. I don't know why, maybe it's just the visual aspect of it, having to tell the time and everything. And usually it wasn't really this. It was about the angle. For example, an acute angle or obtuse angle. So I made sure whenever I looked at clocks, I always noticed the angle first, because I found this to be much easier and was able to save a lot of time by doing this rather than having to guess what the exact time is, because that would be a waste of time. And so it's just really about being methodical about how you approach this, and then you no doubt be able to ace the UCAT abstract reasoning section. So that's it for the UCAT abstract reasoning video. I hope this really helps. I'll just quickly give a summary of what I mentioned in this video. So firstly, don't start off with the most complex shapes. Try starting off with the most simplest shapes. This will really help because you can eliminate distractors and then move up and see if the pattern works with all the shapes. Secondly, look for basic patterns as well as complicated patterns, because sometimes the basic pattern will be really in front of your face and you ignore it and you look too much into complicated patterns and waste a lot of time. So make sure you acknowledge the basic patterns and then move on as quick as possible. The next tip, I think this is tip number 3, tip number 2, is the idea that spend 1 minute trying to find patterns, but no longer than that. You need to really restrict yourself, because in that 1 minute you can try and find like 2 or 3 patterns associated with the shape, and then you can do the 5 answer options and then move on. Whereas if you spend 1.5 minutes, you'll be wasting a lot of time on one section, and then you have less time for another section. And so just really be strict with yourself and time yourself, and then if you realize that you've gone over the limits of 1.5 minutes instead of 1 minute per set, just flag, guess, and move on. It's really helpful in the UCAT because of how time pressured it is. The next rule is don't start with a test shape. This is because if we have a look at the test shape, we create rules that only work for that, and then try and find those same rules within set A or set B, whereas in reality it isn't. And finally, just have a structured way of approaching it. Honestly, it's really helpful if you know what you're looking for, as I mentioned, using lines, interaction, slopes, angles, or this SSSPN. And know your weaknesses, because if you know your weaknesses, you know what to work on. For instance, mine was clocks, and so you can really improve upon them, and on the day you can just review any weaknesses that you've had over the past and ensure that you don't do that in the actual exam. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. If this really helped, please mention down in the comments below and like this video. If you want to see me do more UCAT videos, then please again mention it. And anyways, thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more Imperial videos and also more UCAT videos.